Hi, we'd like to extend our stay
and upgrade.
So, is it all fake? Is green energy an illusion? Is it a farce? Is it just something created to make us think we're doing something good for the planet, but doesn't actually do anything to remove our dependence on fossil fuels? Great question. Keep listening to find out. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Hoteler 360 podcast. I am one of your co-hosts, Ariana Helvai. Lexi is still studying for the bar, as most of you guys know. So if you have a second, wish her good luck, pop her a message, and send her your best wishes, because I know she would just love the extra encouragement. But yeah, so riding solo today. Before we get started, please just take a minute to subscribe to our Substack. It is the social channel that we're using the most these days. It's where we publish all of our articles, our newsletter, and yeah, it's just like a really, really big deal for us if you guys subscribe to that. So please take a moment to do that. It would mean the world to both Lexi and I. We're putting in a lot of time into Substack these days because it kind of feels like a good place for us to build the kind of community we're looking for. So we're using that definitely more than Instagram, LinkedIn, or any other social channels at this time. So please, please, please go subscribe to our Substack. There is both a paid option and a free option. So, take full advantage. And while you're at it, go ahead and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Oh, there's something in my eye. Go ahead and subscribe to our YouTube channel as well, because that platform also needs a lot of love. And yeah, I think that's about all I have for housekeeping. How is everybody doing? I feel like since the agriculture season, obviously, we have slowed down producing podcast episodes this summer. And, we knew we were going to do that because Lexi's going to be studying for the bar. I was going to be manning Hotel Earth alone for most of it. And, we had just produced an entire season that was a bunch of research and a lot of work, honestly. So we were just kind of still, and we are still riding that sort of research wave, I guess, because we still have tons of content to share. All the podcast episodes are produced and released, but there's just so much rich content that came from our interviews and from the research that we did, that we just have like lots to put out with that. So creating new podcast episodes. I know we released one while we were together in San Francisco, maybe a month or so ago, about social media burnout, which is a super interesting episode. But today I got inspired to do this episode because, well, as the title suggests, I got let's say I got sent down a sort of rabbit hole recently, a sort of climate doom spiral, if you will, from a piece of content that I saw. I'll get into all the details later, but it kind of encouraged me to write this article, which is published on Substack, about green energy and its effectiveness. And I decided, hey, why don't I just make a podcast episode? Because for those of you who prefer to listen or watch, if you're on YouTube or Spotify, then I can just tell you about this rabbit hole experience and what I discovered. So yeah, that's kind of what I want to get into today. Where do I even start? Let's start with the Instagram post I saw that inspired all of this. So one day, scrolling Instagram, I saw a video clip that quite literally sent me spiraling. For context, the video clip was of Billy Bob Thornton, and he was delivering a monologue in a show on Paramount called Landman. Maybe some of you guys have seen it. I know my mom has talked about the show. I have never seen the show. So I've never seen it. I obviously know who Billy Bob Thornton was or is. He's not dead. I obviously know who he is. So, I was watching and it like just caught my eye because it was a monologue about specifically wind turbines, I think, or wind energy. But regardless, his character, Tommy Morris, in this monologue spends about 5 minutes arguing that green energy is a farce. It is an illusion to make us think we're doing something good for the planet, but doesn't actually lower our dependence on fossil fuels. He honed in on wind energy specifically and wind energy's environmental footprint. But in the monologue, he was also alluding to solar panels and electric vehicles and other forms of sort of like alternative energy. He continued to exclaim that the illusion projects beyond just energy and energy usage, that the demand for fossil fuels seeps into everyday comforts and infrastructure. Basically everything from concrete to rubber tires to, you know, uh, plastic outdoor seating wear to lotion and soaps. You name it, it's in everything. If you guys want to watch the scene from Landman that I'm referring to, again, head to our Substack. I've linked the 5-minute monologue in the Substack article and you can watch it there. But yeah, basically, that scene inspired me to ask the question or dive deeper into this question: is green energy an illusion? Because everything he was saying in the monologue, honestly, even me as an environmental advocate and professional, made a lot of sense. Okay. So after watching the video, I was quite literally crashing out. I was like, what the heck? Are we living in a simulation? How could years and years and years of learning about the green transition be debunked by a 5-minute monologue from a Paramount show? So I was just like, I was honestly freaking out. And I caught myself, and before diving headfirst into a really deep and dark climate doom spiral, I decided to just research. I decided to just whip out the computer and start diving into some of the archives because I figured if I was going to unravel all of my beliefs about the dire need for a clean energy transition, for this paradigm shift that I've been advocating for since I was in college, um, I should surrender ship as informed as possible. And I guess I'll give you guys the spoiler alert now that this should really be a lesson for all of us to not get our news and facts just from social media and the algorithm that social media pushes. We even talked about this a little bit in our last episode about social media burnout. If you see something that is interesting to you or you think there might be some truth behind it, please fact check that stuff for yourself. Please let this be a learning lesson for that. Again, spoiler alert. Let's continue. Let's get into some of the data. Actually, no, before we get into the data, let's break down first the specific claims that Tommy Norris makes in the video clip in the Landman show. First claim is that there is a massive hidden fossil fuel dependence on alternative energy. And in this case specifically, he was referring to wind energy. Manufacturing wind turbines requires massive amounts of diesel for mining raw materials, melting steel, mixing concrete, and hauling heavy parts of the infrastructure. Okay, so that's claim number one. Claim number two: wind turbines have a heavy operational oil use as they require petroleum based oil and synthetic lubricants to function, prevent mechanical failure, and winterize gears in freezing weather. And claim number three: Wind energy has an unaddressed carbon debt. He claims a wind turbine will never produce enough clean energy over its 20 to 25-year lifetime to offset the initial carbon footprint required to build it. So, the first 2 points are true. They're technically true. Renewable energy manufacturing is currently dependent on a fossil fuel supply chain, and that's just a fact. That's without a doubt. However, science overwhelmingly rejects that final statement, point number 3, that a wind turbine will never produce enough clean energy over its lifetime to offset its initial carbon footprint. So, with that being proven and that just being scientific evidence, I was just looking to explore how alternative energies do repay that initial carbon debt and whether or not the payoff is actually worth it, like actually checks out when compared to the use of fossil fuels for powering an energy grid. So, let's break this down first by carbon footprint and energy payback by energy source. So I'm going to break down all of the major alternative energy sources that we use currently and just analyze their carbon footprint and their energy payback. So it's important to note here that when we are evaluating the environmental impact of an energy source, scientists look at life cycle greenhouse gas emissions, which is measured in grams of CO2 equivalent per kilowatt hour. So we can think of this as like the top to bottom, soup to nuts calculation of energy production and energy grid production. It includes the entire process, okay, from mining the raw materials to manufacturing the infrastructure to the transportation of the infrastructure and the machinery through all the decades of operations and then to that final stage of decommissioning. So the data I'm about to share represents global consensus findings from institutions like the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, also known as the IPCC, and the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, also known as the NREL. So let's start off with wind because that's where Tommy was really honing in on in his monologue. And I'm just gonna read this like boom 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 bullet points because I don't think that the data, like the numbers, you guys may not even really remember. It's probably easier to read, but at least this way we can just like I can say it, we can refer back to it, and I don't have to spend too much time hopefully on like this like kind of more I guess esoteric boring kind of data. But let's just start with wind. So in its life cycle, its whole life cycle emissions, wind energy will emit anywhere between 11 to 14 CO2 per kilowatt hour. Its fossil fuel dependence is admittedly high initially during raw material extraction, such as like steel for the steel tower, concrete for its foundation, and specialized transport because obviously the infrastructure for wind turbines is so massive. um, and operating turbines also require standard lubricant oil changes. So that's on its fossil fuel dependence. Its carbon payback, its like offsets, can be described as well, like its entire manufacturing and construction carbon footprint is offsetted within 5 to 8 months of activation. So, over its 25-year lifespan, it generates roughly between 20 to 25 times the energy used to build it. This fact right here is actually directly debunking one of Tommy's claims, where he's like, the wind turbine in its lifetime will never produce enough energy to offset the fossil fuels used to install it. I mean, again, let me just repeat, it gets offset, the carbon offsets within 5 to 8 months of activation. So that's just like straight up debunked. Let's move on to solar panels and solar energy. Life cycle emissions are between 25 and 48 CO2 per kilowatt hour. Just as a note, the thin film panels tend to have a lower impact, while silicone based panels tend to skew higher on this life cycle emission scale, just due to the high heat manufacturing process. Solar energy's fossil fuel dependence has kind of heavy upstream energy requirements because quartz needs to be heated in furnaces to create silicone wafers, and electronic components rely very heavily on global shipping networks. But the payback is usually done within 1 to 2 years of operation, depending on, of course, local sunlight levels. So they produce emissions free electricity for the remaining 23 plus years of their lifespan. So again, paid back relatively quickly within 2 years. Okay, hydropower. Life cycle emissions of 4 to 24 CO2 units per kilowatt hour. And these levels can spike temporarily if decaying flooded vegetation creates localized methane emissions, kind of like a local wetland or bog situation. The fossil fuel dependence is quite exceptional upfront, because of the massive volume of concrete required to build hydropower infrastructure and dams. But the payback becomes nearly negligible over time because hydro plants are one of the few forms of infrastructure, green energy or alternative energy infrastructure, that can last for up to 100 years with actually pretty minimal ongoing maintenance. So, yeah, their initial construction footprint, which is high, like no one's negating that, gets canceled out over time because of their very long operational lifespan. Ooh, okay, everyone's favorite, nuclear. Nuclear sits right around 12 CO2 units per kilowatt hour for life cycle emissions. Fossil fuel dependence is high upfront because of the very large concrete containment structures for nuclear power plants. Power plants. For nuclear power plants. Also, significant energy is required for uranium mining, milling, and isotopic enrichment. So, all that to be considered, it does have a high upfront carbon cost. But the payback of nuclear power plants is usually done within 1 to 2 months of operation, which is insanely fast because, again, they last for a really long time and they operate at a near 100% capacity routinely for 60 to 80 years. So, again, that upfront carbon cost gets paid off very quickly within maximum a couple months of operation. Okay, and the last energy source I'm going to go over today is geothermal energy. Geothermal has a life cycle emission rate of around 38 to 45 CO2 units per kilowatt hour. Its fossil fuel dependence is, again, really high up front and very high emissions up front because of the diesel powered drilling rigs tapping into underground reservoirs. And minor operational emissions occur for geothermal, operational use when trapped underground gases like CO2 and hydrogen sulfide escape during the steam extraction. But the payback is usually done within a year of activation. So all carbon debts are paid back within a year because they can continuously run on baseload power for 30 to 50, sometimes even more years. So I hope that made sense. Um, Basically, what I just tried to do there is compare the emissions of each energy source in its lifetime and its life cycle versus how much it costs them in fossil fuel use. And I was trying to analyze the carbon debt, and the carbon payoff for each of those sources. And as we can see in each of them, they do have high upfront fossil fuel costs, but they are all paid back maximum within, I think the longest is 2 years. And I think that one was for solar, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, solar panels and solar energy usually pay off their carbon debt within 1 to 2 years. The rest are within a couple months or a few months. So high upfront fossil fuel costs, but over time it's paid back, and if anything, operating on little to no fossil fuels whatsoever during their operational lifespan. So Tommy, this gets interesting because Tommy Norris makes an error. I think the fundamental error is when he is treating the upfront carbon costs of renewables as equal to the continuous carbon cost of fossil fuels. And we see, I just went over all of the kilowatt hours, the CO2 units per kilowatt hour for each of those sources, but I put in the Substack article I wrote, I put a graph in there, and I'll just kind of like, maybe I can include it in the video so you guys can see it, but like here I'll just read out loud what the different I'll repeat the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, the 5 different alternative energy life cycle emission units as compared to fossil fuels. So, just as a quick recap, for CO2 units per kilowatt hour, aka the life cycle greenhouse gas emissions unit, wind had 11, nuclear is at 12, hydropower is at 24, solar is at 38, geothermal at 40, okay? But natural gas at 490 CO2 units per kilowatt hour, and coal at 820 CO2 units per kilowatt hour. Let's get something clear. Initially, there is a undeniable, very high demand for fossil fuels to get the infrastructure of renewables up and running. That can't even argue. Tommy Norris was 100% right about, and I think it's actually useful to talk about that. Like, it is useful to understand that the process of putting up renewable energy does involve a dependence on fossil fuels. However, throughout their entire life cycle, the emissions are not only just very clearly lower than that of fossil fuels, but their carbon debt is paid off within maximum a couple years of operation. And I want to backtrack to Tommy Norris being right about something, because he was right about something very critical. I feel like his major critique was actually about our dependence on fossil fuels. So, despite some of his exaggerated claims attempting to debunk the effectiveness of green energy sources, Tommy Norris makes the following quote, and I think it's a really remarkable point. He says, "There ain't nobody to blame but the demand that we keep pumping it." And he was referring to fossil fuels, of course. In his monologue, Tommy does acknowledge the devastating impact fossil fuels have on the climate. But further, he emphasizes again that the dependence is so high because our demand requires it. And I think this is a really key piece of this puzzle to understand. We see that carbon payback and payoff is really quick for renewables. So there's no questioning their effectiveness to produce energy for a grid without the operational use of fossil fuels. Okay, again, I want to emphasize operational here because there is a difference between, like those initial phases of installing a renewable energy plant. But the operational use of fossil fuels is negligible when it comes to renewables. Obviously, they're producing an energy grid using a renewable source. So, yeah, clearly. But I actually think Tommy Norris's monologue helps us ask and like pose a better question. At least this is what it did for me after like doing a deeper dive. I think the real question here is, how do we remove fossil fuels from the supply chain altogether? Or how can we at least minimize it as much as possible? Because the question isn't about the effectiveness of renewable energy sources, it's about the dependence on fossil fuels to get them up and running, essentially. And, I'm obviously not the very first person to ever ask this question. There is a there's both a massive academic research movement, but also industrial research movement explicitly asking this exact question. Like, I am not unique in this, um, in posing this question whatsoever. And I would like to welcome you all to a conversation known as decarbonizing the supply chain, because that's what this is. That's what we were discussing right now. Decarbonizing the supply chain. It is a whole industry. There's tons of research going on in there. And I personally just have to give a big thank you to Tommy Norris and the writers of Paramount for forcing me to understand this concept better. But let's talk about the decarbonizing, uh, the supply chain decarbonization. Let's talk about that a little bit. There are one, two, three, four. There are four main areas of focus for this research. Okay. That is the steel issue. That is the concrete issue. That is the solar silicon issue. And finally, it is the transport issue. So let me just dive into each of these a little bit deeper. When it comes to steel, wind turbine towers are primarily made of steel. Traditional steelmaking relies heavily on coal to heat, blast furnaces, and strip oxygen away from iron ore, which can release or does release vast amounts of CO2. Current research focuses on replacing coal entirely with green hydrogen, which is hydrogen produced by splitting water using renewable electricity. And major research and industrial initiatives, such as the Hybrid project in Sweden, and have successfully pioneered hydrogen direct reduction. Instead of emitting CO2, the byproduct of this steelmaking process is literally just pure water vapor, which is a little problematic because water vapor in itself can be a greenhouse gas, but another tangent. But organizations like DNV are actively studying the integration of green steel directly into wind turbine supply chains to bring turbine manufacturing emissions close to zero. So there's that. When it comes to the concrete problem, um, I think most of the research focus is in finding alternative binders and electrification. So wind turbine bases and nuclear containment structures require so much concrete, like thousands of tons of concrete, and producing traditional cement accounts for roughly 8% of global emissions, driven by fossil fueled kilns running at 1,450 degrees Celsius. So I can't even fathom how much that is, actually. And the chemical release of CO2 from limestone. So industrial researchers are exploring two parallel tracks, as I said, electrifying the heat source and rewriting basically that chemical recipe for concrete. And research bodies are testing high temperature electric plasma kilns and concentrated solar thermal energy to eliminate fossil fuels needed to heat the kilns. In addition, companies like Brimstone have developed a process to make carbon neutral cement using calcium silicate rocks instead of limestone. And this process entirely bypasses the chemical CO2 emissions. So cool to know that there's research happening there to find alternative ways to make binders. Solar and silicon. So solar panels are made from quartz, which must be baked in industrial furnaces to create solar grade polysilicon. Historically, the majority of the world's solar panels were manufactured in regions with coal heavy grids, like places in China, for example. meaning that solar panels initially had a higher carbon debt, like I said earlier in this episode. But moving manufacturing facilities to geographic regions with inherently clean baseload grids, creating a circular loop where clean energy is used to manufacture more clean energy, is a way to surpass this particular issue. And manufacturing plants are frequently and increasingly built in areas powered by cheap hydropower and nuclear energy. This is happening across Europe and North America already. When a solar factory runs on 100% clean grid energy, the life cycle carbon footprint of the resulting solar panels drops by over 50% immediately. So this is like a really interesting method to reduce that initial carbon footprint. And finally, the transport issue. Hauling massive wind turbine blades, heavy nuclear components, and millions of solar panels around the globe relies heavily on diesel burning cargo ships, trains, trucks, you name it. And decarbonizing heavy maritime freight and logistics using e-fuels, green ammonia, and electrification is something that is being explored right now. So, global shipping giants are building out fleets of ships designed to run on green methanol or ammonia. For land transport, specialized heavy haul logistics companies are beginning to deploy megawatt charging electric semi trucks specifically engineered to move heavy industrial components for the infrastructure of renewable energy plants. I will link a research paper in the show notes for more on this if you're interested in reading it. It's very, very interesting, and it dives further into the like transport specific issue um on like a more analytical level. So yeah, that's basically the main areas of focus for the decarbonizing the supply chain conversation and research. But we still need to address the issue of lowering demand, right? We still need to address the issue that the way culturally we operate is heavily dependent on fossil fuels. And, Lexi and I have spoken about this pretty extensively on this podcast, like both in the plastic season as well as the agriculture season. We've talked about how we really need to start shifting this mindset of dependence on fossil fuels and fossil fuel products. If there's anything Lexi and I have learned from all of the work we do here for the Hoteler 360 platform and all the research we've been doing, it's that every single consumer choice is a vote. It is a vote for the type of world we want to see and we want to live in, and we want our future generations to live in ultimately. Do we want to choose quality or convenience? Do we want to choose secure future or prodigal present? Do we want functioning ecosystems or mass extinction? I mean, it's really that simple. I know that it seems harder than it is, like it seems more complicated, but when you're going to the store and you're looking at your body lotion and you see like petroleum or petroleum jelly or petroleum based products in the back of the ingredients list, like, or you see that the bottle is not made, for example, from recycled plastic, like, that's a vote. You choosing to buy that product is a vote for the type of system you want to see. Like, it's that simple. That's what educated consumer decisions look like. It's making a choice at the checkout counter based on your knowledge and based on the kind of future you want to see, honestly. Like, that's what that looks like. And we've talked about this in our other episodes in the agriculture season, I believe episodes 6 and 7. We've discussed this. Episode 6 was the food policies exposed episode. Episode 7 of the agriculture season was the consumer rebellion episode, and both of those episodes for sure, they don't talk about fossil fuels specifically, but we talk some more generally about what shifting consumer demand looks like and how much power we have in that, because all markets and ultimately all government, not all government, I should say, let's say capitalism is 100% dependent on market trends. And we dive into that. And market trends are set by consumers and what demand we're shaping. So it actually is a very big deal. And so when you're at the store, you're at the checkout counter, that's up to you. That decision comes down to you. So that's how granular this conversation can get. But also, we talked about this in the plastic season, in episode 4, I think, which was about plastic environmental movements and policy shifts. And obviously, plastic is a fossil fuel and petroleum based product. So we do tie into like fossil fuels a little bit more specifically in that episode and in that whole season in general. But yeah, that's another good one to just kind of get caught up on how we shape the demand and how policy shifts can actually happen. I'd like to wrap this up because I'm not used to actually speaking to a microphone for this long by myself. It's like actually really nice to have Lexi to like bounce my conversation off of. So I'm getting tired, but also like, I think I've said most of what I need to say, but I do want to conclude the analysis by saying yes, Tommy Norris in Landman in his monologue makes a few great points. Namely, it is true. Yes, green energy requires upfront carbon costs. Yes, our demand for fossil fuel is so high that green alternatives would not be able to keep up with that demand. No, the carbon payoff for green energy is not negligible, however. From infrastructure production to operations to final teardown, it is still decisively much less carbon intense from the burning of fossil fuels, and that's just a fact. And yes, there is research being done to decarbonize supply chains of renewable energy sources. And I just want to close off this episode by saying I think we need to start asking the following questions. One, we're comparing energy sources, their impact, and ultimately their carbon payoff. Number one, at what point of the process do the bulk of the emissions actually happen? Is it in the initial kind of manufacturing and installation process of the renewable energy source of the power plant, or is it happening during its lifetime? Because that is a huge difference. Like the lifetime use versus the initial installment use are two different things. We're talking about insanely different quantities, and one is a lot easier to manage than the other. And I'll just give you a hint, it's not the operational fossil fuel count. So for fossil fuels, 90% to 95% of emissions are occurring during operation from constantly burning the fuel. And for renewables, it's around 99% of the emissions total are happening up front during manufacturing, and then they drop drastically, if not disappear, during operation. So, something I think we should consider. Number 2, how much greenhouse gases are released to actually generate the energy? And this does kind of tie into the first question, but just to further this point, generating electricity via traditional coal, for example, releases 70 to 80 times more greenhouse gases per kilowatt hour than wind power over an identical life cycle. So again, just reiterating a little bit with this question, honing more in on the electricity and energy production part of it, how much emissions are happening to create energy grids for people to survive off of. And again, we see that with fossil fuels, it's a lot higher. Fossil fuels and coal is a lot higher, 70 to 80 times more than wind power, solar, whatever. Again, the 70 to 80 times more specific to coal as compared to wind. But from the data I gave earlier, we can see that this is true for all of the alternative energy sources as compared to the use of fossil fuels. The final question I think we should ask ourselves when comparing energy sources and their impact and ultimately their payoff is it improving or worsening the overall supply chain and the overall supply chain's impact specifically? As the electrical grid naturally transitions to include more wind and solar, the factories making those panels and turbines are increasingly powered by clean energy. So, what does that mean? That means that the upstream carbon footprint of manufacturing renewables comes to a steady decrease over time. So, this is really important. Like, the more we adapt our energy grids to use renewables, the lower our dependence can be on fossil fuels to create the infrastructure in the first place. So, like, this is how we close the loop. So, yeah, in my in my opinion, you guys can disagree with me on this, open for debate, but I think it's worth it to use the limited fossil fuels we have to create the infrastructure and then use that infrastructure to power grids so that when we make more infrastructure, it's being powered from renewables. Does that make sense? That's how we lower our dependence on fossil fuels. That I think is a informed consumer-led decision. Um, so the more that that gets voted for, the more that that gets approved, the more that we support energy grids that are powered by renewables, the more that government approves that kind of infrastructure. I mean, we see in the Trump administration that this kind of stuff gets constantly getting shut down. So, under certain administrations, we're going to see a continued dependence on fossil fuels. Um, and yeah, these types of people will make arguments that renewable energy still uses fossil fuels anyway, and as we saw that that's true, but how can we improve the overall supply chain? We make energy come from renewables. That way that even the upfront costs to make renewable energy plants can be done with alternative energies. So that's my analysis on this. In a way, I am really glad that I saw the clip and that I went down that sort of climate doom spiral for a second because it really did make me dive deeper into this and understand it so much better, understand what it means to decarbonize a supply chain so much better and our dependence on fossil fuels for renewables so much better. Um, and honestly, now I feel prepped for anyone who wants to rain on my Hope Corps parade. I hope you feel the same. And like I said, I'm open to discussion on this. I said that on my Substack, or I said that on our Substack as well. So, like, if you have ideas, comment on this because I know it's kind of controversial, but it shouldn't be. I mean, I guess that's like why this is open for discussion because like I don't think it's that controversial. I think it's kind of simple, but maybe I'm wrong about that and you guys can comment and let me know. Anyways, thank you for listening. Please, share this with other people as well if you feel so inclined. It helps us get found, of course, and yeah, we're a growing platform. We could definitely use the support in that way. Lexi and I will be reunited again after she takes the bar. Her celebratory trip does include coming to Italy to see me. So we're going to spend some time together. I can't guarantee a lot of work will be done during that time. I feel like it's going to be August in Italy. The whole country shuts down to party basically. So like that's probably going to be us. Oh my god, I need water. 1 second. Oh my god, I was parched. But, I think we will. I mean, Hotel Earth is such an essential part of our being at this point that we probably will sit down and maybe record an episode together, even if it's just a fun episode of us like catching up and talking about our bar experience maybe, or like our vacation maybe at the end. Or maybe we'll sit down and like we will talk about something really esoteric and like record it, kind of like what we did with the social media burnout episode. Regardless, we're gonna be together soon, so expect content and pictures of us together. If you want to see photos of us together, of course you need to follow us on Instagram, or as I have been plugging this entire episode, subscribe to our Substack. Please, please, please. If you're our friend and you're not subscribed to our Substack, I don't even know what to say. Like that, it's free, as I said, and you don't even have to have a Substack account. Like you should make one because it's fun, but like you just need to plug in your email and like you'll get the newsletters and the articles directly sent to your email. So please do that. Okay? Anyways, I had a lot of fun doing this deep dive. It's always fun to connect with you guys via these different mediums and talk about this like esoteric shit with you all. Um, and like I said, open to discussion. So comment or share or whatever you need to do. And you know where to find us, but let's just do a recap of that. I already talked about Substack. I already talked about Instagram. That's at Hotel Earth 360. We have a website, which is also nice, hotel360.com if you need to find out more information. And, YouTube, like I said, please subscribe there too. It needs a lot of love. And video editing is not for the faint of heart. And I do it all by myself. Well, lately. We usually have Bob, but she's off for the summer. But yeah, thank you again for listening. Have a lovely summer if I don't speak to you again. Again, like I might hop back on here in August at some point. Who knows? But yeah, otherwise I'll see you guys or you'll hear from me soon. And I'm hoping to see you guys in the comments section of some of our different platforms. So um I'll be awaiting your engagement. Thank you so much and we'll chat soon. Bye.